and it harnesses the power of partnership. Now, over the next 2 days, we'll have policymakers, senior tech leaders, World Bank staff, AI artists, expert innovators, and youth leaders discussing how we can identify new scalable solutions for youth and accelerate the creation of more and better jobs for young people. Now, the summit has 3 clear objectives. First, we would like to spotlight innovative solutions to youth employment led by our S4Y partners during the several Spark sessions, which are sessions structured as short introduction to fresh new ideas and their impact on the youth employment challenges. Now, we'll hear about innovation on online gig work, social protection for informal workers, digital job for rural youth, refugees, new solution in agriculture, health sector jobs, the creative sector. So those Spark session is very short, but we truly hope that this rapid conversation will spark further discussion and new collaboration within the bank, with our external partners in the coming months. A second objective is to discuss the recent developments in generative AI and what it means for youth employment. Now, generative AI or Gen AI can boost youth employment, can create new jobs, new career paths, can enhance productivity, and even enable new forms of learning. But at the same time, can disrupt jobs, especially those jobs that are based on repetitive skills. So we learn from leading experts how this new development will impact youth employment. The opening panel of day one will feature 2 important tech leaders, Microsoft and Duolingo, and then the governments of UAE, Egypt, and India, in a public-private dialogue on opportunities for you in the age of the Gen AI. And on the second day, we'll have a very interesting and I would say energetic session on jobs in the creative sector, when we'll have young artists that will share and will also demo how they use AI in music and films to grow their art business. Lastly, an important objective of the summit is to celebrate youth as solution creators on development challenges. To do this, we have a Pecha Kucha storytelling session today as the last session, during which we will hear from inspiring youth social entrepreneurs who really use their passion and their creativity to address complex social challenges in their community. So I look forward to this keynote discussion, to the summit over the next 2 days, and I would like to thank you for your attention, and over to you, Namita.
Thank you very much, Federica. And with that, let's just dive into Gen AI. Again, as Federica said, it's creating a lot of possible solutions perhaps in how we address youth employment, but there are also some concerns. And so what better than LinkedIn perhaps to kick it off? LinkedIn has been digging into their own data and trying to understand what this means for the world of work. So I'd like to invite Karen. Karen Kimbrough is Chief Economist at LinkedIn to share with us some insights that they've gathered recently. Then after Karen presents her presentation, I'm going to invite Marcio Cruz, who's Principal Economist at IFC, and Stein Brook from OECD to also share some perspectives. Maybe I'll invite Stein first to give us the perspective of the OECD, from an OECD perspective, and then perhaps Marcio to also try and help us make sense of what this means for developing countries, in particular Africa. So over to you, Karen.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, and good morning or good afternoon to all of you joined us today. It's really an honor to be here. So I want to say thank you again to the World Bank and Solutions for Youth Employment Working Group to create the space where we can discuss how generative AI might impact young workers. So with that, just much gratitude from myself at LinkedIn to be part of this conversation. And what I'd like to do in just maybe the next 15 minutes or so is quickly walk you through some of the work that we've done looking at our data And if you go to the next slide, you can get a sense of what our data is all about. So we're a marketplace that connects right now over 1 billion professionals globally. We just hit that milestone. And there are also 65 million companies across 200 different countries and territories that also are participating on our platform. And of course, thousands of schools and all these individuals bring a wealth of skills. So with that in mind, what I would say is that even with 1 billion members, we want to acknowledge upfront that our data is not perfectly representative as a snapshot of the entire global workforce. There are always gaps in any country, but we do believe it can provide a pretty rich insight into the trends around the changing workforce, particularly in tech-enabled sectors. So this may be a place where we can actually say something useful for this audience. And just as a check, we did actually do representativeness analysis with the World Bank back in 2016. So that helps us facilitate this anonymized, aggregated, and real-time set of insights that we use for dozens of projects at the World Bank and other multilateral institutions through our Data for Impact program. So I don't want to dwell too long, but I just want you to know that we think very carefully about what our data can and can't say, and we're just excited to partner with the World Bank through the Data for Impact program on this. So with that, let me go ahead and start. So we'll go to the next slide, please. And as you can see, our data, we call it the economic graph. And we firmly believe in a future of work that is equitable, sustainable, and resilient. And we do this just trying to identify labor market trends because these are at the heart of our vision, where we can really create that economic opportunity for every member of the workforce. So that's kind of our guiding mission. Let's go into what I wanted to talk to you about today. So if you can go to the next slide, please. We're going to talk a little bit about AI skills and how they're increasing and spreading across the globe. I want to go through generative AI and how we think it's going to change skills that are required for many of the jobs. And I'll share with you how we get to that conclusion. And then I want to talk a little bit about skills disruption, that generative AI is not going to affect all of us in the same way. So while it's going to, I think, spread relatively quickly across the globe, and I do think it will mean change for all of us, I don't think we're all going to be touched in the same way. And that's probably at the heart of what we want to talk about here. So with that in mind, let's go to the next slide. So already what I can tell you is that when you look at our data, we see that there are 9 times more AI talent on our platform this past June than there was in January of 2016. So already in about 7 years, there's a 9x increase in the amount of AI talent. It's spreading really quickly, to my earlier point. Some countries are leading the pack. So we see, for example, Singapore, Finland, Ireland, India, Canada are experiencing some of the fastest rates of AI skill diffusion, this measure of how AI skills are moving through the workforce. And you might ask, I got asked this one question about like, why is it that we're seeing it in certain countries like this and not others? A lot of it has to do with programs that are potentially either accelerating training or that are focused on upskilling. Or of course, there's a lot of access elements that also drive this. So where the access to the technology is better and more reliable, you will see more adoption and diffusion. Let's go to the next slide, please, if you will. Okay, so this chart on the left is giving you a sense of just how we're seeing AI skills increasing in any one country. So each line on the left, and I know you can't read all those lines, each line on the left represents a country that started in 2016 and is now where we are here in 2023. How many AI skills in aggregate do we see in this country as a share of members? And the list on the right is alphabetical, so that's not how the lines are ordered. But you'll see again, there's certain countries that are definitely outstripping others, and I mentioned India and Singapore and Finland, Ireland. And then there are some that, even the ones that you might say are lagging at the bottom, they are in fact also still increasing. So that gives me a lot of hope in my thesis that this trend of AI skills moving through the workforce in all the countries is going to continue. But of course, the gap is widening. When we look on the right-hand side of my slide, I just wanted to quickly touch on this. When you look at what skills we are, kind of seeing grow quickest, a lot of them are generative AI skills. So in 2022, we surveyed what are the 5 fastest growing AI related skills. We do this every year. 2022 was the first year where we saw generative AI skills at the top of the pack. So that's question and answering, which is up 330%, if you can believe that, on the year. Classification skills, recommender system skills, computer vision skills. I think that's a lot related to like images and video. If you were a TikTok watcher or things like that, that's what computer vision is all about. And then natural language processing, which is really powerful, of course, because that is something that allows you not to have to be a trained coder to enter your commands and your prompts, but actually let you write in plain English or plain whatever language you speak. If it's Spanish or French or Tagalog, you should be able to write your commands and prompts in your language and have, for example, generative AI work for you. And then just quickly, a little fun fact maybe at the bottom. We have seen in the last 5 years a 3x increase in roles on LinkedIn that are head of AI. So that near tripling in heads of artificial intelligence, that role on our platform suggests that many, many companies are indeed starting to push and recognize that they need to have the AI expertise running all the way through a function, and that requires a head. So seeing a lot of that opportunity there. Let me go on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So just a quick check for those of you who might want a reminder, the AI, of course, is artificial intelligence. Generative AI is a completely kind of an offshoot of it. It's the idea of like thinking about, can we use text, video, messages, audio, code, data, and then GPT, generative pre-trained transformer, that idea of interactive conversational work with an AI. Think about email, writing essays from a blank page or an outline. All of that, these are the terms that we're using. We are going to focus today a little bit on GAI, but I just wanted to call that out. And then on the right, we actually can look at keywords, and we've explored how generative AI's impact is on the labor market. And we can actually explore this. And what we found is that since early April of this year, there's been a 25% increase in the number of LinkedIn members who are posting mentioning generative AI keywords. So this is in the US. But that's a pretty impressive increase month over month. In fact, it's beyond impressive. It's sort of shocking. So there is an element that I would candidly say is a little bit of a hype phase for AI right now. Everybody's sort of flocking to it, trying to explore it and understand it. But it's definitely much more than a flash in the pan. I really do think this is something that's here to stay. When we look just at how our members are operating with their profiles, what they share publicly on the platform, we can see that since the start of the year, there's been on average a 75% increase each month in members worldwide adding terms like GAI, ChatGPT, prompt engineering, prompt crafting, and so forth. They're adding these to their profile, saying these are skills I have, these are things that I've worked on, these are things I want to learn about. And there's a 75% increase month over month worldwide. So it's huge. This is a really, really big deal. In June, we saw members adding certain keywords to their profile 15 times more frequently than in January. So again, that idea that even since January, even since 10, 11 months ago, we're seeing this really rapid adoption and increase. And it doesn't mean that all of us are, by the way, perfectly fluent as AI experts. It means that we're starting to play around with it. We may have some work experience with it, or we're using a tool that is AI enabled, and so our AI literacy is growing. This is kind of what this is meaning. This doesn't mean that we're all going to become engineers creating large language models by any stretch of the imagination. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the things that I try to remind people when I talk about our data is just how fast skills change in our data for any particular occupation. Generative AI is one factor of many that is causing this change in skills over time. And I would actually say not just causing, but it's accelerating the rate of change. And let me give you an example of what I mean. So prior to this sort of GAI, generative AI hype that sort of came onto our screens last year around this time, we were already seeing that the skills required for any job were changing really rapidly. And we had projected that by 2030, this is like the pre-AI hype phase, we thought that about 60% of the skills required for any job would be rotating or changing, evolving. And that is from a base of, say, like 2016. So from 2016 to 2030, we were expecting this pretty rapid change in skills. Now, I just want to quickly say, most of the change was happening in technological skills, not in, say, what you might call professional skills, or you might call your people skills. So people skill might be communication. We're having a conversation here. I'm communicating some data. That's communication skill. But the technical skills, what coding language did we use? What were the approaches and techniques we used to identify these trends? Those are technical skills that are evolving really rapidly. So already we thought there was a 60% change. When AI came onto the screens for us, onto the forefront, that change accelerated even further to 65%. So I just want to kind of underline or underscore how important this is in terms of not just changing generally and like a fast adoption by a lot of people, but also the fact that it's accelerating the rate of change. And that's going to be meaningful and important for us when we think about education and learning. So some of the things where we're seeing change, for example, I'll give you one example, then we'll move on, is the green transition, so electrification of the energy grid, automotive transitions that are happening towards electric vehicles. We're seeing that in the construction sector, of course, which is also looking to have more sustainable construction. We're seeing it in automation generally across manufacturing, healthcare, transportation. And then we also see this applications, digitalization outside of generative AI. So think social media marketing, which is a real job, by the way, and a really important one in this day and age. We're seeing more tools for analyzing big data. And we're seeing a lot of this analysis going towards what are your cybersecurity needs. So we're seeing a lot of change happening everywhere in a lot of different domains. And I just wanted to kind of point that out before we move on. So we can go to the next slide now. So I mentioned, of course, the rate of change is happening really quickly, but it does mean that it's going to affect a lot of us. We right now think that generative AI will disrupt or augment occupational skill needs for about half of LinkedIn members. So there's a difference, of course, between disruption and augmenting, but in either dimension, we're expecting people to be affected, that their skill sets are going to need to change. And you can see this by country. So on the left-hand side is a bar showing India with, a little over 50% of members in that country, our members in that country, we think have some degree of exposure, and likely it's a disrupting exposure. There is a smaller percentage slice, that lighter blue color, that is in the middle, and that is going to be the set that we think is probably augmented by generative AI. And then there's a set that we think is right now largely insulated from it. And you could think of roles, a lot of roles that are related to anything think about, let's say, physical trainers, sometimes actors. Not, that doesn't say that the creative side is insulated from this, but there are lots of different kind of very physical human occupations like dancer where we don't think AI is largely going to infiltrate very quickly. It could, but we don't think so. So this is a bar chart that replicates for a lot of countries. You can see it from India and Indonesia all the way across to the US and Turkey. And I would say what I would most underscore in this is that this is a point in time estimate. And if you come back in a year or two, it might look very different because AI is going to continue to evolve across our sectors, our industries, our economies. And so that will change the mix of folks who are affected, who are in some way insulated, augmented, or disrupted. What I wanted to know before we go on, though, is like one of the things we can see is there isn't any real correlation between what you might consider how advanced the economy is or its sort of exposure, right? The U.S. is sitting right next to in the same space as Indonesia and Brazil and Chile. So there's and Australia. So there's really no sense that like just because you're say in a developing country or an advanced economy that you are in some ways better protected or more exposed. I think we're all going to be impacted. The other thing I would say is just for the US here is that many of the disrupted roles, the roles where we think people are going to have to change the most because so many of their skills in those roles are actually ones that generative AI can also or will soon perform. Many of those are held by people who have bachelor's degrees and they earn more than the median income. So this is for the US. So these are people in the US who have a bachelor's degree, they've gone to college, they have a 4-year degree, they earn more than the median income, and we think that they are often in the space where they're going to have the most disruption. So it's really can affect anyone and everyone. And I suspect that this holds globally, but we will see with time. So let's go to the next slide. So how do we look at this? So actually, if you could go back one slide for me. Thanks. I just want to quickly say, so we tried to think about this and I'm going to be really brief here, but we tried to think about this in terms of like what skills, if you're in an occupation, let's start with an occupation, economist, I'll take my occupation, what skills are generally required that are replicable with GAI, and what skills often required for my role or any role as an economist are complementary to generative AI. And think of it as like in some cases there are skills that are required that really map to tasks that generative AI can do, and there are skills that are required that really we don't map to generative AI, and these are ones that maybe we would only want a person to do. And so any occupation has a mix of those. I'm kind of simplifying it a little bit. And so what we did is we tried to identify a list of over 500 skills that are likely to be either affected by generative AI technologies. And you could think about these as like, and they were listed on the right, like at the bottom are people skills, think about time management, but also at the top are business skills, financial reporting. These are all skills that generative AI could perform. There are also different people skills that generative AI probably cannot perform, like leadership and communication, that sort of motivational communication you would want from a manager. Those are things we don't expect GI to do. All right, next slide, please. It's right. So now what I want to kind of give you a sense of, this is a little hard to read, but we took any particular occupation. At the top row is say teacher, and we said, what are the share of skills that are specifically, augmentable by generative AI? And we said, okay, well, there's about a little, maybe 45% of skills that a teacher needs could be augmented by generative AI. And there's also, we kind of tried to identify what some of these skills or tasks, because you can think of them also as tasks, were like lesson planning. You could imagine a teacher might use generative AI to expand or, change how she or he thinks about curricula or lesson planning. how they might want to organize teacher training. It doesn't mean they do all the teacher training with generative AI, but they might want to think about how they organize it, how they plan for it, how they enhance it. And so just using this as a guide, we tried to go through hundreds of occupations to determine what share of requisite skills fell in which type of bucket, whether they were replicable by generative AI or they were complementary. So a complementary skill might be something that really you want a teacher, a human, to be doing. And it could be something, like elementary education or special education, classroom management. These are things you want someone to be using their empathy, their EQ to try to understand nuances. Okay, so that's what we did. Let's go to the next slide. And here we categorized occupations also as whether they were augmenting or disrupting or insulating. And what that means is, are there core skills in the augmenting side? Think about core skills that really probably include a large share of generative AI replicable and generative AI complementary skills. So a data analyst is a really good example of this because a lot of their work could be replicable by generative AI, but a lot of it also would require cross-functional influencing, for example, which is more of a human skill. Then there are jobs that are going to be disrupted, and by disrupted, I mean maybe that they have a relatively large proportion of generative AI replicable skills and a small proportion of skills that would draw more from either their professional base or their personal skills. Sometimes we point to things like language translator as one that's particularly disrupted. Also administrative assistant, where you have a lot of tasks that can actually be done with AI tools and technologies. And then there are ones that are insulated. I mentioned these earlier. Think about maybe a real estate agent, or think about like a personal PE coach or something like that. Okay, let's go to the next. I'm conscious of time, so I'll keep moving. So the next slide is really showing you how we mapped all these occupations, so hundreds of occupations, on a grid and said which ones do we think are occupations most likely to be augmented, and that's that upper right. And you'll say, oh, okay, I do think a software engineer, but also, by the way, a cashier might be augmented by using AI. I do think that a web designer would probably find AI augmenting what they can do. They're using those things to make themselves more productive, to get more done, possibly even be more creative sometimes. But there's also, a lot of folks who may be disrupted, and that's that bottom right that we just talked about. Think about administrative assistant again, possibly librarian, which is one of my personally favorite occupations. It's what I wanted to be when I was little. So I hate the idea they're going to be disrupted, but I do believe there's still something about someone in the library picking out the best book for the best little kid. And so I have faith that there's still a human element to librarian. But you'll get a sense of how we mapped all of these over time. I want to go a little faster because I want to leave time for our discussants. So the next slide is really thinking about how do we see disruption disproportionately affecting different groups. So this is Indonesia, for example. These are the share of our Indonesian members. You can see that there is a relatively large proportion of disruption sitting in, for tech. This is a dark blue bar, right? So dark blue bar showing the degree of disruption. So a lot in tech, a lot in financial services, manufacturing, maybe a little bit less in what you might call oil and gas and mining at the bottom, or hospitals and healthcare, which makes sense. But you can just see that just 4 industries generate a lot of disruption, and that is probably not surprising if you think about manufacturing, professional services, financial services, and tech, and we do see that replicated. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to zoom through this. So let's talk about something related to youth. So roles that are currently occupied by youth are more likely to face disruption. This is what we're finding. This is because young people are more likely to occupy junior roles that are responsible for tasks that tend to be a little bit more routine. That's how you learn on things, right? And so it's not that youth in and of themselves are somehow more exposed, it's that they occupy roles that have a lot of routinized tasks. But the bright side is that in many places, young folks are also more likely to be fluent in technology. They're more like digitally native. So they're going to be better prepared to kind of leverage generative AI tools, I think, and they actually may see you know, in my opinion, there's a potential for actually higher productivity because they're going to be better able to use these technologies and tools. So I feel that, you know, even though our data points to kind of a very sort of somber story, there is still hope there. And we just showed a bunch of different countries and how the degree of younger members, which we're calling Gen Z, are exposed. Let me go to the next slide. So the other thing that we're seeing is that women are also overrepresented in roles that are likely to face disruption. I mentioned administrative assistant. I mentioned librarian. There are lots of roles where, for a variety of reasons, women are overrepresented. These are ones that are more likely to face disruption. Men are overrepresented in roles that are less likely to face disruption. Think like electrical engineer. So there is you know, an element of inequity that we need to think about that's sort of baked in. And when you add this generative AI transition happening, it could exacerbate things more. And I think we really need to think about how do we urgently address this now, so that we can ensure better outcomes overall. Okay, I am coming to the end. This is actually my last slide. If you don't, yeah, thank you so much. So this is my last slide. I really wanted to just sort of highlight a couple of things that I think are important takeaways here. There's so many potential discussions that we could have from these data cuts. I ran through them so I could leave time for the discussants. But I think that we, you know, should understand that these all raise challenges for development experts. And I hope that you'll hear more from this at this conference in the next coming days. We're going to co-publish a note with them exploring how this data can complement labor market surveys to map out the road ahead. But here's some thoughts. You know, remember that the equitable access requires investment, and we want to ensure that people everywhere have access to the potential. We need to have widespread digital infrastructure, data servers, data centers, connectivity. We need the data. It needs to be collected in a transparent and privacy-preserving way. It needs to be relevant to local contexts. So you can't use US data and then expect that a Kenyan cohort is going to find it as useful as a US cohort, and vice versa. So we need to have local data. We need to think about learning. How do we make sure that youth have all the skills they need? How do we ensure that people can learn over time? Lifelong learning, you can hear me say that a lot. We've actually seen AI skills becoming more popular on our platform, and we've unlocked dozens and dozens of free AI courses that people can take on LinkedIn Learning, just if they want to facilitate their own skill alignment. But we do believe overall, much greater investment is going to be required to bring people up so they are at least AI literate. Again, we don't have to all be AI coders, but we all need to be AI literate. And then finally, last and not very much not least, is thinking about how do we have systems to assess and track the skills that we need. We've seen that like educational institutions or previous titles are becoming less relevant to the job market. So where you went to school, what job you had, and it's really more about skills. What skills do you bring for a role? So using that skills first approach, how do we take that to increase hiring pipelines, create avenues for people to access opportunity and advance equity for candidates? So we're eager to think about this together with our multilateral partners. And how can we best build out all these skills first hiring systems that mean that AI and generative AI are something like a wind at our back, pushing all of us forward, as opposed to a wind at our forehead for some of us, leaving us further behind. And so with that, I will say thank you so much and turn it back over to you.
Thanks a lot, Karen. And I really appreciate the fact that this is such a fast evolving, such a new development, and that we are all trying to wrap our heads around it. And there's very little data, there's very little established methodology. So you know, great that you took a crack at it. And it's very clear. Two things struck me about what you said. Number one, I think from a youth perspective, you know, we always said how with digital technology, the world was becoming VUCA, right? Like it was becoming more volatile. It was becoming more, you know, ambiguous, more complex, more uncertain for young people. So it sounds like this is going to be like many times more now for young people. So the ability among all of this, the ability to quickly adapt and to quickly learn is going to be even more important. The second thing that struck me about what you said is that context is going to matter. Like which country you're talking about is going to matter, particularly where that country is in its structural transformation process, what that economy looks like, what does their labor market looks like, right? I mean, what occupations are dominant in a particular country? And thirdly, I think just the demographics of a particular country. Are there a lot of young people, women, what kinds of occupations they're doing? So I think it's going to fall very differently on each country. So I think let's turn to our discussants to kind of help us unpack a little bit this whole context question. So I'll turn to Stein first. Stein, who will give us the perspective from the OECD countries, and then we'll turn it back to Marcio to give us the perspective from what it means for. So over to you, Stein.
Thank you, Namita, and also Karen for a really interesting presentation. So let me try and share some slides with you. Should be in front of you now. So what I'd like to do is very brief. I don't know. Yeah, you can still see my screen. In July, the OECD published a report, the OECD Employment Outlook, which we publish every year, but which this year had a focus on artificial intelligence. And what we try to do is to summarize the emerging evidence on AI and its impact on the labor market, which is not easy because we just I just say we have very little information and data about AI and its impact on the labor market. So what I'm presenting here is really the early impact of AI on the labor market. And what I should also say is that we're still at the early phases of adoption of AI. So I suspect that in terms of adoption rates, we're still in the low digits, single digits in terms of adoption among firms and primarily along large firms. But I think adoption is growing fast, and I think we'll see a lot of change in the next few years to come. So let me try and present to you in a few slides, because I only have a few minutes, try and present to you some of the key findings of our research on the impact of AI on the labor market. One of the biggest questions that we get is, of course, will AI lead to a jobless future? And this always comes up with new technologies. We have, in 2022, we carried out a survey in manufacturing and finance sectors of 7 OECD countries. There's the US, Canada, Germany, Austria, UK, Ireland, and France. We surveyed more than 2,000 employers, and we asked them whether AI had an impact on jobs in their firms so far. And more than half of employers told us that there hadn't really been an impact on employment within the firm to date. The other half was about equally split between, yes, AI has increased overall headcount in the firm, and the other half said, well, it actually decreased it. So overall, we don't find an impact of employment so far. In fact, that coincides also with more macro analysis that we've tried to do, where we also didn't see at occupational level an impact of exposure to AI on employment growth. Now, of course, again, as I said earlier, we're at the early stages, things might still change. Also, employers always tell us that they don't actually like dismissing workers. Instead, what they like to do is make use of voluntary quits and retirements to adjust their workforce. And one other interesting finding that comes out of our work is that employers, when they adopt AI, they do more with less. And so they tell us we will grow as a business, but we won't hire anymore. That's finding consistent with previous waves of technologies that we've seen in the past. Now, what is interesting is that workers themselves do appear to be concerned and worried about the impact of AI. So we had another survey also carried out in 22 in the same countries and sectors of workers. We surveyed more than 5,300 workers in those countries and sectors. And as this chart shows, 3 in 5 workers were worried about losing their job to AI in the next 10 years. And if you look at the left side of this chart, we actually have 1 in 5 workers being very or extremely worried. Now, what's interesting also is that, and I don't show this in this chart, but workers who actually work directly with AI are even more worried about losing their jobs. So presumably there are workers who know what the technology is capable of. This is also consistent with the OECD's estimates of automation. Now, these estimates reflect AI technologies, but they also reflect other automating technologies, more robots, etc. When we look at these latest estimates that the OECD published earlier this year, we find that 27% of employment is in occupations that are at high risk of automation. So the risk of automation remains very high. That doesn't mean that automation will actually happen. This is a theoretical risk. There are plenty of reasons why it may not happen. And also, we should remember that technology creates jobs as well as destroys them. One fascinating finding from our research is that AI can have a very positive impact on job quality. So we've asked the workers who work with AI, what impact has AI had on your performance, on your enjoyment of the job, on your physical and mental health? And overall, we find that workers are very positive about the impact of AI on job quality. So 4 out of 5 workers told us that AI had improved their performance. 3 in 5 said it had increased their enjoyment at work. And also, as you can see, there are positive impacts on physical and mental health. That's not to say that AI doesn't bring risks. For example, 3 in 4 workers told us that AI has increased work pace, and workers are also very worried about some of the ethical issues, for example, data collection and privacy. There are also concerns about wages and the impact that AI will have on wages in the future, with 40% telling us that they expect AI to decrease wages in their sectors. What is clear, and this came very clearly from Karen's presentation, is that AI is already changing the tasks that workers do on the job. 50% of users that we surveyed told us that AI has made some of their skills less valuable already. And at the same time, we have employers telling us that 40% of employers tell us that the lack of skills is a barrier to adopting AI. So investing in training education will be critical if we want to accompany this AI transition. Another interesting finding from our research is that the workers who say that they received training to work with AI are also the workers who are more positive about the impact that AI has had on their job. Similarly, and again, this is a policy implication, the workers who told us that their company or their employer consults them about the use of new technologies, the adoption of new technologies, are also the workers who are more positive about the impact of AI on their jobs. This highlights the importance of social dialogue when it comes to the adoption of AI. Now, there are many other issues I could talk about, but in the last slide that I have in this presentation, and relevant also to the bigger question that's being asked today, is what impact will this have on youth? Now, I tend to be a rather optimistic person when it comes to the impact of technologies on the labor market. I think traditionally, big technologies have always led to more and better jobs, but I do think there are a few red flags that we need to watch very carefully when it comes to youth and artificial intelligence. The first point to make is that AI or young people tend to be on more precarious contracts than older workers, and so they're easier to get rid of than older workers when they're automating technology. So I think that is something already to be concerned about. Another thing that our other research has shown in the past is when you look, for example, at labor market polarization and changes in the labor market in the past, a lot of this has happened through young people entering different jobs than young people entered 10 or 20 years ago. So it's young people who really bear the brunt of the adjustments in the labor market. Now, because AI is a general purpose technology that will likely affect all sectors and occupations, there's 2 questions that we need to ask ourselves. Sure, some jobs might get destroyed and other jobs will appear elsewhere, but the question is, to what extent will the number of jobs created elsewhere be sufficient to cover the jobs that are being destroyed? And this is combined also with a very fast speed of development and adoption of these technologies, which, if it doesn't leave enough time to adjust, for the labor market to adjust, might lead to higher rates of frictional unemployment. And again, I fear, particularly among young people. That only highlights for me the importance of investing in the education and training to make sure that young people are prepared for the new jobs that arise. I will stop my presentation here, but I'm sure there will be further questions in the discussion later on. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Svein. I think in a lot of ways, a lot of what you said also resonated with what Karen was saying. I have a few questions that I wanted to ask you, but maybe I'll turn it in the interest of time. I'll first invite Marcio to talk to us about what you think is going to be the impact on developing countries. How should we think about it? Marcio?
Hi, Namita. Thank you very much. Well, first of all, let me congratulate Kari and Stigen for their presentation. I think they present quite fascinating trends. Let me share also some slides here. Can you see the slides?
Yes, go ahead, Marcio.
Yes. Okay, great. So basically, what I'll try to bring to this discussion is a perspective towards developing countries. More specifically, this is based on some studies that we're conducting here at IFC with respect to digitalization in Africa, focus on business, and particularly the perspective from the demand side. The idea that usually when you're thinking about how workers, how people who use technology to be productive, this usually happens to firms. So understanding what is the demand that's coming across these countries is quite important. So focus on Africa. One important message that we have when you try to understand the business landscape in Africa is the fact that Africa has a very small number of firms able to generate good quality jobs. So in these charts here, on the left-hand side, you can see on the bars the number of firms divided by small, medium, large. Just to give a sense, small firms are firms with 5 or more workers, and less than 20. Medium firms are firms between 20 and 100 workers, and large firms are firms with more than 100 workers. And what we observe in Africa is that you do have across the continent about 3 million firms with 5 or more workers. Among them, like 2 million are formal, which usually reflects that these are more capable firms. And less than 20% of the labor force work for firms with 20 or more workers in Africa. So that means that you have a huge amount of the labor force, about 70%, that are work with micro business, and the large majority are basically self-employed. Now, why this matters? Because better jobs for more people require more and better firms. So in this chart here, on the left-hand side, what you do observe in each of these dots is the number of firms per 1,000 working age population on the vertical axis, and the horizontal axis, you do see the correlation with GDP per capita. And you do observe that there's a very clear negative association between the number of self-employed people with respect to your population and your income. And on the other hand, there's a very strong and robust and positive association between the number of firms with 20 or more workers and income per capita. So it's not only a matter of having firms with quality, but you do need to have more firms, a matter of a combination of quantity and quality. And how is all this associated with the previous presentation in terms of AI and other kind of sophisticated technologies? No? In our recent work that I've been conducting with Xavier Cireira from the World Bank and Diego Comina at Dartmouth College, we have been measuring the level of technology sophistication of firms across the world. So basically, this chart on the left-hand side try to give a sense of the technological divide across countries. And then, and here we have countries that are in the frontier, for example, Korea, all the way to countries that are significantly far from the frontier, many of them concentrate in the African continent. And then the orange dot shows us the average level of sophistication, and the brown dot shows us where the top 20% of firms stands. So basically, here is a very complex kind of measure, but we try to convert that into an index that goes to make it very simple, from 1 to 5. And what that means, if you're in the index around 1, it means that you are basically conducting all your business using very rudimentary, manual, very basic technologies. If you are close to the index of 5, it means that you are using the most sophisticated technology available to perform business tasks. In this case, for example, artificial intelligence. So basically, what you do observe as expected that the firms in Korea are on the top, particularly firms that are on the top 20%. They are very close to the technological frontier, but even firms in Korea, that's a quite interesting point, that are quite technologically sophisticated. They are still far from been using quite intensively technologies like AI, robots, 3D printer, so far and so on. And then we can see that for many of developing countries, these firms, even the firms that are in the top 20%, are significantly far from it. Now, the most interesting part of this is that when you compare Kenya and Korea, for example, what's interesting about these countries is that they have a similar population of around 50 million people, is that not only the level of sophistication of firms in Korea are much higher than firms in Kenya, but they have many more firms, about 7 times more firms using these more sophisticated technologies, which employ significantly more people and consequently generate much more opportunity for people to use this type of skills that Carrie was mentioned that the people have been acquiring. Now, we know that the digital entrepreneurship can be an enabler for tech diffusion. And then on the left-hand side here, we do observe from a database of a Crunchbase in which we try to basically understand what are the kind of disruptive technologies that digital tech startups are using. And when we compare Africa with LAC and frontier markets such as like Silicon Valley, London, New York, we do observe that in Africa there's a disproportional use of mobile payments and cloud computing. But even among these tech firms in Africa, we do observe that they are still not using machine learning significantly. They're quite far from the frontier. Now, what inspiring something like an optimist message from this is that you do see that among the youngest firms in these countries, including Africa, are the ones that are usually being more disruptive, are the ones that are using more of this kind of disruptive technologies. However, we do observe in this research that the premium for disruptiveness, which means that the amount of funding that these firms are managed to receive in Africa are much lower than in other countries, even accounting for the different terms of income per capita. So that led us to three, I think, important questions towards this discussion. That is, what can AI do to facilitate technology fusion, the creation of a large number of good quality firms? This is quite critical. Who may benefit most from this process, and how can we build strong market incentives to direct AI solutions towards entrepreneurship, a labor complementary task? Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to continue with the discussion.
Thank you so much, Marcio. And you know, listening to you and listening to Karen and listening to Stein, the one thing that struck me was from a youth perspective, it's about how. So Gen AI and AI is a train that's already left the station, right? I mean, it's happening. So how can we wrap our heads around, particularly from a developing country point of view, preparing young people for this? And what struck me was that, you know, part of the whole skill development agenda is with our schools and colleges, right? But it seems that to prepare our young people for this new world of work, schools and colleges are not going to be enough. There's a lot that the on-the-job training is going to have to handle. Because these are changes that are happening so rapidly that you've barely left college and the world has changed under your feet. So it's on the job that's going to be important. And the second thing is kind of a lifelong learning agenda. Well, if it's lifelong learning and if it's on the job, it requires an employer, perhaps, right, on the other side, that is going to take on this responsibility of reskilling young people. But then listening to you, Marcio, I'm thinking a lot of our youth don't have an employer. They are self-employed. Or as the world of non-standard work increases and people are doing gig work or they're on platforms, there is no clear employer. So then what does that mean for this vacuum that a lot of people are going to be in, where they've left school, they've left college, the world is changing around them, and there's really no employer to give them this kind of new level of skills that are needed. I mean, I think those are questions that really came up, and I just want to say a big thank you to our three speakers. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Stein. Thank you, Marcio. We have two minutes left. Literally, we want to end it on time. But I don't know if any of you wanted to turn to each other, perhaps with a question, or Stein, you or Marcio have a question for Karen in particular, something short, sharp, because we have just literally 2 minutes.
I can ask a question of them. I have a very
Okay,
quick question.
sure.
If
Karen, go.
there was one thing that you would like to see us us here collectively focus on, is there one thing that we should do above all else to get started to prepare youth?
Marcio, do you want to take a crack at it from the African perspective, perhaps?
Yeah, a quick point. So something that I think it's important in this process, particularly for youth. And I think, by the way, Karen, I'm a big fan of a LinkedIn database and the collaboration with the bank. I do think that the platforms like LinkedIn, I'm not trying to make promotion here, Karen, but I do think that they can play an important role on improving the matching of the type of skills of entrepreneurs that you may have otherwise going, for example, to work to public sector or to work in other kind of activities that if you're not able to improve this kind of allocation, this may lead to a kind of mismatching that I do think is a big problem for developing countries and particularly in the African context and for youth. Because in many cases you are missing like this story that the missing Einstein story, right? Like you are missing a lot of bright people that are not going to the right sort of activities in which they potentially could be generating more jobs, for example, more activities towards other youth people. Now, a key question is how to handle the needs for finance for them, no? And that's something that I think institutions like ours should make sure that we try to support.
And clearly, thank you, Marcio. Clearly, this is an agenda for which I think we need to regroup and perhaps continue this conversation. But I just want to say a big thank you. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Marcio, and thank you, Stein, for joining us today. We'll wrap it up here because our next session is going to start. Our next session is a public-private dialogue, and I hope that all of you can join us there. Thank you so much.